Western Europe in 700 AD is often imagined as a land of decay, a world where the great Roman cities had crumbled into ruins, where knowledge was lost, and where civilization had all but disappeared. The towering amphitheaters, grand forums, and intricate aqueducts were left to rot, with new rulers and settlers living in crude, makeshift villages nearby. This is the popular narrative reinforced by books, movies, and even some historians. But what if this image of a dark and ruined Europe is completely wrong? What if, instead of a wasteland of abandoned Roman cities, many of these places were still thriving, still carrying on the legacy of the empire that once ruled them? To many people of the time, the colossal remains of Roman civilization seemed almost supernatural. The ruins of grand temples and massive stone structures were so far beyond their own architectural abilities that some believed they must have been built by giants. Walking through these remnants, they saw a past that was both glorious and alien. But not all of these cities had been left to decay. Some had remained vibrant, their streets still bustling with life, their buildings still standing, and their rulers still seeing themselves as heirs to Rome. Despite the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many cities in the former Roman provinces remained occupied and functional. The people living there were not ignorant barbarians squatting in the ruins of a once great civilization. Instead, they were rulers, traders, craftsmen, and citizens of emerging kingdoms that still held onto Roman traditions, Roman architecture, and even Roman ways of governance. Far from being a period of complete collapse, the 7th century was a time of transformation, where the old world blended with the new. The fall of Rome is often portrayed as a sudden and catastrophic event, as if the lights of civilization were switched off overnight. But history is rarely that simple. While Britain experienced a severe decline after the Roman withdrawal in the early 400s AD, mainland Europe followed a very different trajectory. In Britain, Roman administrative structures vanished, towns were abandoned, and large-scale stone construction halted for centuries. Many Roman cities were left to rot, their inhabitants either fleeing or being absorbed into new Germanic societies. The Anglo-Saxons who arrived had little interest in Roman urban life and built their own wooden settlements, often near the ruins of former Roman towns. It wasn't until much later that Britain saw a revival of city life. By 700 AD, some Roman towns in Britain were beginning to be resettled, but many had been lost forever. Unlike the mainland, where old cities continued to be used, Britain experienced a true urban collapse. The once thriving Roman cities faded from the landscape, their names and locations forgotten. Some never returned. But in mainland Europe, the story was entirely different. Take Cologne, for example, known in Roman times as Colonia Agrippina. Founded in the 1st century AD, it had been a major Roman city for centuries. When the Western Roman Empire fell, one might assume that Cologne followed the same fate as Britain's cities, collapsing into ruin. But archaeological findings tell a different story. Excavations in the 1990s revealed something astonishing. Cologne's Roman infrastructure was still in use even centuries after the empire's fall. The very streets that Roman citizens had walked on were still being used in the 800s AD. The Roman city grid remained intact. The old city walls stood strong, and buildings were still occupied and maintained. Churches had been built into the Roman layout, and even the ruling elite of the Frankish kingdom resided in the very same structures that had once housed Roman officials. This wasn't just a Cologne phenomenon. Across mainland Europe, many Roman cities remained in use. Paris, Trier, Toledo, these cities retained their Roman architecture, their street layouts, and their public spaces. The old Roman forums, once the heart of civic life, continued to serve as gathering places and marketplaces. Amphitheaters, once filled with spectators watching gladiatorial combat, were repurposed for different events under the new rulers. Some even continued to host public spectacles well into the medieval period. In these cities, the transition from Rome to the new Germanic kingdoms was not a story of destruction but adaptation. The kings who ruled over these lands did not see themselves as barbarian warlords erasing the past. They saw themselves as the rightful successors of Rome. Many of them actively sought to preserve Roman traditions. They used Roman titles, upheld Roman laws, and even modeled their rule on the Caesars before them. The Merovingian kings of the Frankish kingdom, for example, did not see themselves as separate from Rome. They walked the same streets, lived in the same palaces, and governed from the same administrative buildings. They held triumphal processions in the manner of Roman emperors, styled themselves as imperial rulers, and ensured that the urban life of the Roman world did not simply vanish overnight. By the time the Carolingians came to power, ruling over a Europe still filled with Roman architecture and infrastructure, the dream of reviving Rome seemed entirely possible. They lived in cities where Roman buildings still stood, traveled along Roman roads that had never fallen into disuse, and ruled over subjects who still identified, at least in part, with the old Roman ways. This is why, when Charlemagne declared himself emperor of the Romans in 800 AD, it didn't seem like an outrageous claim. The empire may have officially ended, but its remnants were still all around him. The Roman roads, the Roman walls, the Roman cities they had endured. Even trade networks, once thought to have collapsed entirely after Rome's fall, continued to function in many areas. Pottery, coins, and artifacts from this period show that urban life persisted, that commerce continued, and that societies remained interconnected. Roman baths still operated in some cities, Roman aqueducts still supplied water, and Roman engineering was still being maintained. And let's not forget the roads. The vast network of highways built by Rome was too valuable to abandon. Many of these roads remained in use for centuries, some even forming the foundations for modern roads still traveled today. These roads ensured that trade, movement, and communication remained possible even in a world that had supposedly collapsed into darkness. So if you had walked through a city like Cologne, Paris, or Toledo in 700 AD, you wouldn't have seen an abandoned ruin. You would have seen merchants selling goods, people going about their daily business, rulers living in grand halls, and a city still standing much as it had for centuries. The image of a completely collapsed Western Europe simply doesn't hold up when we look at the evidence. You step into Cologne in 700 AD. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer persistence of the Roman layout. The streets, though worn by time, still follow the same organized grid that Roman engineers had carefully designed centuries before. Stone walls, built with the precision of Roman craftsmanship, still encircle the city, offering protection just as they had during the empire's heyday. The air is thick with the scent of baked bread, roasted meat, and fresh produce from the market stalls that line the old Roman Forum. Merchants loudly call out their wares, offering textiles, spices, and even imported goods from the distant corners of the world. Gold and silver coins, many still bearing the faces of long-dead Roman emperors, exchange hands, a testament to an economy that never fully collapsed. Noble Frankish warriors, their long hair marking their status, stride through the streets, their richly decorated cloaks fastened with brooches of intricate design. They may no longer call themselves Romans, but their world is still shaped by the empire's legacy. Inside the city, their rulers govern from buildings once occupied by Roman officials, carrying on traditions of law and administration that, while altered, remain unmistakably Roman in character. Nearby, a massive stone structure looms, the remains of a Roman bathhouse. Though partially repurposed, it still serves as a center for communal gathering. Some cities have kept these baths running, maintaining the complex network of aqueducts and underground heating systems that once defined Roman urban life. In others, the ruins of these bathhouses stand as silent reminders of the technological prowess that once flourished in the empire. Walking further, you see a church built directly into the Roman cityscape. Christianity has long since replaced the old pagan religions, but rather than erasing the past, the new faith has woven itself into it. Many churches have been built using materials scavenged from Roman temples and basilicas. In some cases, entire Roman buildings have simply been converted into places of worship, their towering columns now framing altars dedicated to Christ rather than Jupiter. And Cologne isn't alone. In Paris, the old Roman amphitheater, the Arènes de Lutetia, still stands. Once a grand venue for gladiatorial combat, it has taken on new roles, sometimes as a marketplace, sometimes as a space for public gatherings. In Trier, the Porta Nigra, an immense Roman city gate, remains intact, still serving its original function centuries after Rome's legions last marched through its archways. Further south, Toledo streets are lined with buildings that clearly reflect their Roman past. The city remains a hub of administration and trade, now ruled by the Visigoths, but still retaining its classical heritage. Roman bridges span rivers, their stone foundations stronger than anything built since. Roads, worn but functional, continue to guide travelers and merchants across the landscape, ensuring that trade and communication do not grind to a halt. Even in cities where decline is evident, Roman engineering proves its resilience. Old aqueducts, though no longer maintained as they once were, still bring water to some urban centers. Roman harbors continue to facilitate trade along the coasts, and in many towns, markets still operate in the very same spaces where Roman citizens once bartered for goods. While the great amphitheaters may no longer host gladiators and the forums may no longer echo with the debates of Roman senators, these cities are far from dead. They are alive, evolving, and adapting. The world has changed, but it has not disappeared. And as the centuries roll on, these cities will continue to be shaped by their Roman past, standing as a testament to an empire that, in many ways, never truly fell.